That sounded like I meant coughing. I meant coffee. Coffeetorium. There we go. Coffee is a very good thing. But to help get our minds refocused, get us re-energized, and to help our brothers and sisters come back in from the hallway, let's sing a song together. So if you will, grab a hymnal, somewhere near you, and we will sing hymn 429. Let's stand and sing 429 together, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. Let me introduce our third speaker tonight. Dr. Owen Anderson is the pastor at Historic Church of Phoenix out in Peoria. He's been teaching philosophy and religious studies for 23 years. He's actually a professor of philosophy and religious studies at Arizona State University. He's also an adjunct at Phoenix Seminary. He's been a fellow and a scholar at Princeton Seminary. He's published several books, including a philosophical commentary on Job and a book on the natural moral law. We're very thankful that he's come here to teach us today on rebuilding the foundation of education. Fits very well in the series that we're working on. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Owen Anderson.
Thank you. Is this your coffee? You want a coffee? No? All right. Well, I'm very glad to be here and very glad to have heard these first two presentations. And it just showed me how well constructed this afternoon is, because we heard from Mr. Renn on his thesis about decline and what we can do as Christians in a negative world. And then we heard from Dr. Innes, who is a professor at a school that was trying to offer an alternative. And now you get to hear from me, who I'm a professor in the secular academy. I'm currently working at Arizona State University, teaching philosophy, teaching religious studies. And so I titled my paper, A Report from Within the Secular University. What happened to piety and the knowledge of God? So I feel in one sense in which I'm kind of giving you a first-hand account, maybe like the spies that went into Canaan and came back. I'll give you an account, and I hope I'm like Joshua and Caleb as I give my response. But many parents, many Christian parents, maybe some of you, will consider sending their children to a secular university. The purpose of a state university is to offer an affordable university education for the taxpayers. And so it's right for parents to think, well, I should be able to do that. I'm a taxpayer. I should be able to send my children to a state university. But I think you'll find out it's much worse than you imagine. Now, when you first hear I'm a philosopher, you might be a little suspicious. I wouldn't blame you. Say, how did a philosopher sneak in here? Philosophers don't have a good track record, and in fact, we're warned to be wary of worldly and vain philosophy. But if we think about philosophy as the love of wisdom, then I think it helps us reframe it and see how really the biblical worldview is what provides us with how to actually do philosophy. And that reminds me to mention, I have a book on that, on the beginnings of philosophy, on the table. I brought some of my books. I didn't think ahead about bringing any to sell. Because again, as a philosopher, people aren't beating down my doors to buy books. It never crosses my mind. I let Amazon do it for me. So you can look me up on Amazon, and you can see what I have out there. I have some more academic books, but I have some that I've actually written for homeschoolers to introduce them to the biblical worldview and philosophy from the biblical worldview. And that's what I want to talk about, is we compare the university with how it ought to be. And what I've seen as a professor at the university, I feel like I've lived through the second two things you described, those two eras. When I was a student, it was the neutral. And when I was a young professor, it was neutral. And then in the last few years, it's become measurably negative. So I divided my talk into three parts, or I should say incidentally, what I'm going to do is look at, I'm going to tell you a declension story. You heard two declension stories. I'll give you a third one. A decline. But I'm measuring it a little bit differently, because whenever you have a declension story, you have to say, from what? I'm measuring it from old Princeton. I think old Princeton was the high water mark. And the question in my mind, both as a scholar and as a Christian, is what happened? How did we lose that? So I divided my talk into three parts. And I think these are natural questions that come to mind when we think about our current condition. These are, where are we? How do we correctly assess where we're at? Next, how do we get here? How do we go from a time where we might say it was better than now to the current time? And the third one is, where are we going? What happens next? What can we expect? So I'm going to answer the first question as a Christian working in a secular university. I have a perspective from the inside. In fact, people are almost shocked when they meet me. I remember one time speaking with someone, and they were so surprised I was a Christian. They asked me some follow-ups like, but you don't believe in the virgin birth. But you don't believe in the incarnation. So they're trying to probe to see if what I meant was like a cultural Christian or traditional. And when I said, yes, I do, I believe that, I started to feel like an exotic animal in a zoo, where they came here to see the scene and say, I don't really believe those exist. But there they have one in the zoo. It's so strange. I can't believe he still thinks those things. We've progressed past those beliefs. I'm going to answer the second question. So the first question I'll answer as a professor within the university. The second question I'll answer as an intellectual historian. As we think about the idea of decline and what was a high water mark, why would I argue that someone like Hodge represented a high water mark? And then from there, we're able to measure a decline. If we don't have that first fixed point, we don't have a way to measure the decline. And the third one, as someone who works in Reformed theology, I'll answer where are we going, but also as a pastor who's concerned about Christians and Christians living a life in the kind of world we live today, preparing them and helping them to become ready to be established on a firm foundation. So first question, where are we? Now each philosophical system will answer that differently, and you do have some systems who think that we're at the cusp, the height of human development. The professor Steven Pinker wrote a book a few years ago, Enlightenment Now. And it was a response against declension stories, like the closing of the American mind. And he goes through and he catalogs how well we're doing compared to the past. And he makes a number of good points. We've made progress in many areas, health, literacy. But what about in piety and the knowledge of God? He didn't map those, and I think his story would be incomplete without those. So how do we measure a declension story? And I want to tell you a few personal stories about within the academy. I think it will actually, I run very little risk of overstating how bad it is. If I tried to overstate it, I probably still couldn't. And when I've actually started a Substack where I document these things because parents at first didn't believe me. And so most of my Substack, I feel like I'm a reporter. I'm taking off the professor hat, putting a reporter on. And sometimes I do commentary, but sometimes I just put something up and say, this is what is happening at ASU. Parents need to know what they're getting into. If we had to phrase it maybe from biblical terms, we'd say, we live at a time where at universities, good is called evil and evil is called good. Moral debauchery is championed, no longer on a libertarian basis of each mind your own business, but is championed as the preferable way to live. The educated elite approve of it, and they teach others to do the same. The ways of God are mocked, and processes are put in place that can ban the Word of God and label Christians as bigots. And in free speech circles, bigotry doesn't have the right to free speech. So once you get Christians labeled in that, you have an argument of why they should not be on campus. So we have a level of unbelief and decay that we're not familiar with in our own lifetime. Maybe we've read about it in the past, but it is different in the past because we're not, the post-Christian, as we heard so well, is coming out of the Christian. It's not simply a pagan culture in which Christians have gone in to be missionaries. So we have unbelief and the rot and decay of culture. We have increasing statistics about people saying their life is empty. They're struggling with anxiety and depression and meaninglessness because the kinds of things that our world offers, the comforts of our world, really don't provide us for that. In fact, some of our best literature has been written by people in prisons, not comfortable at all. The second greatest English book next to the King James Bible is written by John Bunyan in prison. I've just been reading Solzhenitsyn, who couldn't even write in prison because the guards would confiscate it. He had to memorize his entire books and repeat them to himself in his mind. So when he was out of prison, he could write them down and mail them to Tolstoy's daughter who happened to live in the United States. So comfort and meaning, there's not a direct connection, and sometimes it's the opposite. The more comfortable you are, the more your life doesn't have meaning. So couple of personal examples. Safe spaces. I was asked to go through employee training to learn about how to be a safe professor. And I'm such a nice guy, I didn't ever think I might not be safe. But the training was about genders and about something that's very evil. I don't know if you've heard about it, but I'm sorry to alert you to it. It might give you nightmares. Heteronormativity. Isn't that terrifying? There's this terrible thing going around universities and in culture called heteronormativity, and it must be stopped. And the truth must be told, which is that there are infinite genders. Because as you heard, a gender is just what you think it is. And so it's innumerable. It doesn't end at any place. We've identified, I remember the instructor saying, we've identified this many. And there's more to identify. Well, yeah, when you make stuff up, you can keep going forever, right? But what happens when you take this test is you're warned against heteronormativity, and then you're given a little quiz, and then if you pass it, you're given a sticker, a rainbow sticker, that you can put on your door so students know you're a safe professor. Now you can see the implication. What if you don't have a sticker on your door? That's not a safe professor. And that's what's going on. A shift occurred in our culture. It probably aligned with some of what you heard already about moral sexual choices. From a time, perhaps in the 50s was about the end of it, where it was a matter of morality, to a time when it became a matter of psychology and mental illness, but still mental illness, to a time when it became still a matter of psychology, but it was an issue of understanding how the person got there and trying to comfort them and withhold any judgments, to a time where we live in now where it's proposed as actually the best way to live. Hopefully you'll be against heteronormativity. You'll make these choices yourself. It's a positive good. Next, we've had events at ASU teaching about the positive benefits of witchcraft, particularly different forms of witchcraft that can band together to somehow aid feminism in their cultures. Now, you probably grew up reading Arthur Miller, and you thought of the Salem witch trials in those kind of political terms, mainly like maybe a struggle between men and women for power in those cultures. But still, it was pretend. The whole problem was that witchcraft is not real, and these men were persecuting women who weren't doing anything real. But wait a minute. Now it's being taught as something that's real. And if witchcraft is real, then you can use it to harm your enemies, and no wonder people were worried about it. That changes the whole story, doesn't it? Which one is it? And we see a rise in what they call witchcraft or paganism or the occult, great popularity right now, as people are looking for meaning, looking for a gospel, something to save themselves. They're looking for some other story. And this seems to be one that they think will give them some power. And that's really what this is about. We've had everything reduced to power. Dr. Innes mentioned Nietzsche and his greatest disciple, Michel Foucault, taught that it's all power. Madness is power. What counts as being insane and not insane is just a matter of power. Criminality is just a matter of power. You can redefine it however a society wants. It's all power. There's no truth of the matter. And so history is just a long story of abuses. Just happens they're mostly perpetrated by Christians. And so the bad guys then are Christians, and that's why you get the label Christian nationalist. That's a person who thinks that God gave us a law, whether it's natural law or revealed law, and that law should affect society. Well, that's a Christian nationalist. And it's really overlaps. If it was a diagram, the circle for a Christian nationalist, a circle for white nationalists would almost entirely overlap. They just mean the same thing in most of these talking heads when they speak. They speak derogatorily of both. They're the same. So it's all power, and the only way to prevent power abuses is to have completely diffused power. So no one has any power over anyone else ever again. Except people who didn't have power in the past should be given extra power now to make up for the past. And if you point out, well, that just leads to the same injustices as before, I'd say, yeah, but it's their turn. So what is this thing then, where we're at, this thing called unbelief? Martin Lloyd-Jones gave a definition I like. He said, unbelief is a condition where you're so dominated by another power that you're incapable of thinking clearly. So there is clear thinking, and you can demonstrate what it is, but in unbelief, even when it's presented to you, you can't see it. You don't have eyes to see, ever seeing, never, or ever hearing, never actually hearing, right? But he also said there are clear facts about God and about the gospel. And that's really the contrast that we have with unbelief. Unable to hear and make sense of a sound argument, there are clear facts about God presented to you. So how do we go from that? How do we get from the past to that situation where non-reason and what used to be considered madness are normalized? And not only that, not on a libertarian basis, if everyone does their own thing, but actually advocated for it, to say this is actually a superior way to live. So when we get to that second question, how did we get here? We have to say from where. And I'm personally very suspicious about declension stories. I think declension stories are very easy, and they're mostly motivated by nostalgia. To say, oh, wasn't the past better? We're actually warned against doing that. Don't say the past was better. So I'm not one that's given to declension stories, but I happen to think we have declined. And I especially hold up old school Princeton under Archibald Alexander, Charles Hodge, and then Warfield. In contrast to what you heard earlier defined as liberalism. All three of those, and then Machen, were opposed to what was called theological liberalism in their day. And that now, that's like looking in the rearview mirror. Liberalism is now the conservatism that people say is bad. What they were dealing with we're so far past that kind of liberalism. Liberalism didn't stay liberalism. And this wasn't just liberalism about salvation or the fundamentals of the faith. Princeton was founded with this idea that the goal of a student should be piety, which is the love of God and seeking God out and doing God's will in your life. And you have piety because of the second goal, which is the knowledge of God. Your purpose in studying, whatever discipline it is, each discipline points you to the knowledge of God in its respective field. I saw this thing come up on my social media about the bee, B-E-E. It's eye. It was really interesting. It had a close-up, high-definition picture of the bee's eye. The bee's eye has hair on it to keep pollen off of it. And also they work as lenses of some kind. The bees can see ultraviolet light, lots of different kinds of light that we don't see. It's really interesting. And I got to the last sentence. And it said, and nature made this over millions of years. And that's this facepalm moment, right? The biologist should know better. Not only should biologists be able to define what a woman is, they should be able to tell you that intelligently designed things can't come about by time and chance. And an eye that can see all those levels of light with hair on it is an intelligently designed thing. You don't get there by small steps. So how did we get to where we're at now? I'd like to say we didn't hold on to those two things, piety and the knowledge of God. I don't even hear about those very often in Christian circles. I'll hear about other things which are fine, like classical education. I'm not suggesting that's not a good thing. But insofar as you're being educated, are you learning piety and the knowledge of God? And does that affect all areas of education? Because when you hear that, you might say, well, but Anderson, you teach at a secular school. So you can't do that. You're describing a school that was a religious school at the time. Well, they didn't do it because they were religious, though those categories may not fit back then. They did it because they believed that God's works reveal God. His works of creation reveal him. His works of providence reveal him. And the scholar should know those things. So the secular professor isn't somebody who must be an atheist, isn't someone who says a bee's eye formed from gradual steps over millions of years. A secular professor can very well point to God the Creator and say the thing I'm studying reveals its maker to all of us. Now, I do think we're to expect persecution, and we heard that a little bit earlier today, and I think that's absolutely true. In one way, the Christian's never surprised when there's this kind of flop in society. We kind of expect it. And mentioning again Martin Lloyd-Jones, he actually said, he's speaking in the 60s, in the UK is having its sexual revolution, and he said, I actually prefer this time over the Victorian age. Because the Victorian age had a lot of hypocrites. You went to church, and everyone's in church because it's a thing to do. He said, in our age, the lines are clearly drawn. So there's something to be said about that. And each generation discovers this anew. So one thing people talk about now is deconstruction. And a young person, maybe raised in the faith, comes of age, and they decide, I'm not going to stay a believer. And on top of that, they use the tools that they've just been learned to say, I'm not staying a believer because my parents were heteronormative. And I went to university and found out how bad that is. So I can't believe I was raised under heteronormativity. But again, that's not really anything new. Each generation, no one's born, and in virtue of that, they're a Christian. They have to come to this. They need the work of the Holy Spirit in their life. But the question is why? And I like this idea earlier we heard about dialogue, because I like to ask students that. What's the thought process in your mind? Do you have a good reason for rejecting God or the gospel of Christ? And I haven't yet heard a good reason. In fact, there's only like 5 answers, and they pretty much always boil down to one. It's always some version of the problem of evil. Right? So you'll have Stephen Hawking said to be the smartest man in the whole history of the world. The Aristotelians are like, what? All right. Vine, first or second, they're both up there. And he'll give these arguments, well, calculus proves we can have a singularity that brings the universe into existence from nothing. I say, come on. When it comes down to it, It's very noticeable why he doesn't believe in God. I can't believe in a God who would do this. Make such a brilliant person handicapped, or it becomes personal very fast, right? It usually starts off with something else like, let bad things happen in other countries, but it becomes personal. It's really you. You can't accept this. And so that's an important conversation to be able to have on your part with people. Do you know how to have that conversation with someone? And then they may very well be suffering. Absolutely. They have gone through very hard times. But are you able to have that kind of conversation yourself? What kinds of answers would you give them? Are they kind of what they call pat answers? Platitudes? Or are you able to help someone work through that thought process step by step? I also want to suggest something, and this might be when I get run out of here. But it's in the confession, so I should be safe. Chapter 5.5 on providence. It's worthwhile for Christians to consider the chastising hand of God, individually and on the church. We don't have to assume we've been doing everything perfect and now all of a sudden society flips. It may very well be that we're being called to examine ourselves specifically, and I'm thinking not in social issues, but specifically in piety and the knowledge of God. It's very common that the Lord does two things at the same time: judges Babylon and chastises Israel. Those almost always come together, and it was never hurtful to consider that, especially with neglect. Because a Christian often will examine themselves for overt things that they've done wrong and say, I've done nothing wrong. But it's interesting that when Paul defines sin, he's relying on the Psalms, Romans 3, 10, 11, it begins with not seeking. Neglect. You've been busy doing other things, and think about the four soils as well. The cares of the world choked me. If we're honest with ourselves, have we been seeking God? In question 101 in the Shorter Catechism about hallowed be thy name, it says we're to glorify God in all the ways he's made himself known, which means all of his works of creation and providence. It'd be hard to say we've been doing that. Glorifying God. We pray that every Sunday though, don't we? Hallowed be thy name. So when we see the lines that Martin Lloyd-Jones spoke about drawn so clearly, it's also a challenge to us to be clear about what we're teaching and what we're doing with our own lives. Where are we finding contentment? If our society says, I'm not content unless I have 5 iPhones going at once, and now they want to have an iPhone attached to their face. Have you seen that? I want to walk around like this all day with it. It's like a transparent iPhone so you can see people, but also all of your apps are open. And then maybe I'll be content. It was a challenge for us. Explain why glorifying God and knowing him brings contentment. Can you explain it to yourself first? Can you teach your family? And then maybe you'll be able to teach others as well. And so that challenges us to ask us where we've been finding our joy, and challenges us to have greater faithfulness as we think about how did we get here? How did we go from a time where it'd be just standard to speak about piety and the knowledge of God as the foundation for all education to now? And incidentally, I led a student seminar at Princeton University, and I asked them this question: why are you here? And I had just, like the day before that, I'd been in Firestone Library, got out the original document. Princeton's a founding document where it states these things. And I was looking at it. As a philosopher, it's kind of exciting because I don't do a lot of that archival work. So I said to them, why are you here? Good school guarantees you a good job, lots of money. Prestigious. I'm better than other people. I'm in Princeton, not ASU. I'm a Tiger, not a Sun Devil. Well, neither one can win football games, so I'm not sure. None of them, I didn't expect them to, but I was just curious. None of them said, I'm here for piety and the knowledge of God. And when I asked them that, I said, I was just looking at your founding document, and I do some research on that. I'm something of an intellectual historian myself. Why aren't you here for piety and the knowledge of God? I said, I don't know what you mean. I had to explain what piety is. I never heard of piety. I thought maybe there'd be a classicist who knows about Aeneas. He goes around all the time bragging about how he's pious. But it's directed to an idol. And knowledge of God, of course not. This is a secular university. So this call of how we got here is a call to us to have greater faithfulness and to rebuild those foundations. I like to think about this as the Daniel option. And kind of debate. We heard earlier Charles Taylor was mentioned. He gives the Roman Catholic declension story. It was so good in the medieval ages. Then the Reformation just messed it up. We need to go back to the medieval ages. And you've got the EO, Eastern Orthodox Benedictine option. We need to have monasteries, and there's something to the fact that we don't know how long this is going to take. We might have to hunker down for a while. But it's this idea of rebuilding, and I think we're called to be like Daniel, who certainly understood the Word of God, also understood the Babylonian religion better than they did, and was able to be a faithful witness, have a school of the prophets, the Daniel option. And that's why I suggest we say, where are we going from here? We might like to get a prediction. And I'm not in that business. I'm not an economist. I don't know if you heard about President Truman. Someone asked him, if you could have one thing, what would it be? He said, a one-armed economist. I bet David Innes can guess why. Because I ask my advisors, what should I do? And they say, well, on the one hand, we can do this. On the other hand, we can do that. I just want one answer. Right? So I'm not a one-armed economist. I'm not predicting in that sense of where we're going. We may very well have this flop for some time. However, as I've been writing my Substack and bringing it to parents' attention, bringing it to legislators' attention, I've been very happy about the response of also parents saying, this is going to stop. I'm not doing this nonsense. Lawmakers getting involved and saying, we're not letting state universities be treated like this. So that's good. But we have to be involved in that way. We have to be ready to get engaged. And it's not always fun or comfortable, but it's always good. And we ourselves need to make use of this idea of piety and the knowledge of God. Hodge's Systematics, I should write a blurb for them because they're coming out with a new edition, because sometimes he'll just go into these 2-page long Latin quotes. And so most readers can't read through that. So they're coming out with a new edition that has the English with a Latin footnote. But Hodge's Systematics really do a good job of explaining to us the world systems that we're dealing with. Nothing different has really come up. And the Reformed system in contrast to those. We have use of that. We have the ability to address the major philosophies, the vain philosophies that have raised themselves up in our day, and to call them that. And that's why I make that case in one of my books, that really that's the beginning of philosophy. What we find in Proverbs or Job or Ecclesiastes. And it's what will give us the prevention of looking to one of these other worldly systems. And when we understand the worldly systems, we're able to do what we're told in 2 Corinthians 10:5, which is demolish every stronghold that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. That's our goal. And I think we see in Westminster Shorter Catechism, if we think about a couple of the answers to questions like number 1, what's the chief end of man? Everyone knows that. Rick Warren quotes that, right? Glorify God, enjoy Him forever. But it comes down to, what do you mean by glorifying Him? That's going to be key. But then think about 46, which is about the first commandment. The first commandment commands you to know God, it says. And then I mentioned 101 already about hallowed be thy name. What does that mean to glorify the name of God? Well, it's to know Him in all the ways He's made Himself known. If you love God, what could be better than that? That's really what happens on Valentine's Day, right? The Valentine, when someone's in that romantic relationship, they want to know everything they can about the other person. You don't have to tell them to do it. You don't have to remind them, hey, you should spend time with them and get to know them. If you're doing that, you're past the Valentine stage of the relationship, right? But you want to seek them out, and you want to understand them, and you write these cards, and they have to be specific. I don't know if you've ever made a mistake in this area. You can't say, I love you, nice hair. You got to give some good details about like what distinguishes this person from other people. Why are they special to you? And that'd be a good challenge for people to say, write out about God. Why do you love God? And is it just generic kind of platitudes? Or can you get into some details about your life and the way God's worked in your life? Can you get into ways that you've come to know God through His works of creation and providence? Maybe you see a picture of the bee's eye, and you're kind of blown away by the wisdom of God. I had never even considered what would happen with pollen getting in his eye. Well, God did consider that. He thought about that. He made the bee this way. So the secular university, as well as a school like Phoenix Seminary, which is to train ministers, both of them still have as their foundation piety and the knowledge of God. The students should be taught that. And today we see them being taught not neutrality. I came up as an undergraduate in the age of neutrality. I was mentioning to a couple people at the break that a theory came to me that those professors that were doing more neutral, they were all atheists, but they're neutral, didn't generally speak poorly of Christianity. I bet all their parents were Christians. And they left the faith, but they still respect their parents. And I bet the ones that were more hostile, I don't know, and I'm not a social scientist, but this could be a good study, Templeton might fund it, are the current ones who are so anti-Christian. I bet they weren't raised Christian. They're just doing what they were raised to do. And that's really what we should see, is that both of these things happen. The believing system develops itself to the glory of God. The unbelieving system develops itself also to the glory of God, but it's to the justice of God. And we're seeing that today. What did Hamlet say? Things rank are coming up. And we see that today. That also reveals something about God. What happens when you depart from piety and the knowledge of God? Do things go really well for you? Turns out they don't. And it's amazing, and shouldn't be amazing, how perfectly Romans 1 and 2 describe it, right? Shouldn't be surprising to say, yeah, of course, it gets it exactly right. But it is kind of surprising, like, wow, this is exactly what happens. We're living through it. And that does reveal something to us about God. It shouldn't surprise us, but it's also not something that we need to fret over, because it's important that God's justice is revealed as well. What happens to a society that's the most affluent in human history? Think about the things people complain about in our group, Americans, compared to what would be in the past. Like, oh, my limb just fell off from leprosy. Oh, man, I was 5 minutes late to the conference today because this guy was going so slow in the fast lane. I think they call them first world problems, right? And think about what's revealed. You have the most affluent situation in all of human history. Now, what happens if you also have the most ungodly situation in human history? The very people who have the blessings that we heard about earlier, that Steven Pinker goes through in Enlightenment Now. He's right about those blessings. Those very blessings are used for ungodliness. Question, is that going to turn out good? We know the answer, but history is also revealing that answer and exactly what it looks like. So we can expect that principle of unbelief to work itself out and deepen the revelation of the glory of God. And we should have eyes to see that, and the ability to have conversations with others to help them to see it. Now, we know that education can't save us. So we don't look to old Princeton, we don't look to piety and the knowledge of God for foundation of education to save ourselves. But we don't abandon education because of that either. Some people do. They'll say, yeah, that's intellectualism, we should become anti-intellectual. No, in all the things that we do, we should still glorify God, including education, and we should rightly recognize that God is the one who provides us with the foundation of education, and that all things we learn about glorify Him. So, in conclusion, and philosophers aren't like preachers, because how do you know when a pastor's halfway through a sermon? He says, in conclusion. So I have to decide which one am I doing. This really is a conclusion. God's been very gracious to us, Christians. He's given us a clear revelation of Himself, His glory. He's worked redemptively in the world. He continues to do so. He's patiently disciplined us when we need it. Hasn't let us go off on our own, but He's called us back like a good shepherd. And He's given us a firm foundation on which to build our lives, families, churches, education, civil government, even as we confront unbelief in our day. So I'd encourage us in the Reformed world to remember what we've already been given and build on the strength of the past. Build on what old school Princeton, what thinkers like Hodge, Archibald Alexander, Benjamin Warfield developed for us, and use that to address the challenges that we see going on today. And if sin is defined as not seeking, not understanding, and not doing what is right, let's do the opposite. So if you say, what was Anderson's 3 things that we should do in light of a negative world? Seek, understand, do what is right. God's there, God's revealed to us. That's my favorite, one of my favorite titles for a book. I like the book too, but it's a good title. Francis Schaeffer. He's there, and he's not silent, in contrast to what the world usually says. If God exists, he's silent, he doesn't do anything. So, thank the Lord for piety and the knowledge of God. Thank you.
So I loved and agreed with, I think he said it in jest, but Dr. Anderson's metaphor of Joshua and Caleb in the Holy Land. And I think that's a great thing for us to think about. This is Numbers chapter 14. Throughout this conference, right? I mean, we've talked about sobering truths. Christians ought not to run from the truth. We ought not to pull the wool over our eyes. So we've engaged with, the reality of how things have fallen, where we are right now. And those things are sobering, and they're a call to action, but they're not a cause for fear. So I think in a lot of ways, what Dr. Anderson was doing was giving the same report that Joshua and Caleb gave, right? When Joshua and Caleb, when the other spies talked about the Holy Land, they talked about what? Nephilim. We're like grasshoppers compared to them. It's a bad situation, right? It's scary. But that wasn't how God's servants replied. Dr. Anderson gave us Caleb's response. Numbers chapter 13, verse 30. Let us go up at once, for we are well able to overcome it. And then in Joshua's words, the Lord delights in us, and he will bring us into his land. That's the positive hope, right? It may seem like there are giants in this land, but the Lord delights in his people. And so we are like Joshua and Caleb, and we follow Dr. Anderson in that. That was a wonderful picture of that. So let's take a 10-minute break. Our breaks always go long because there's too much good fellowship. So stop having fellowship. Stop enjoying each other's company. Just get coffee really quickly, and then we'll try to come back here at 4:30. We're actually ahead of schedule. When does that ever happen at a Presbyterian conference? So we'll try to come back at 4:30, and we'll have our Q&A discussion panel. So let's take a break.